Kirk's legacy to the conservative movement is to persuade people that conservatism is a proper philosophy with an intellectual underpinning which can hold its own against socialism and liberalism in all the conflicts and disputes of the modern world. And I think this is a very important legacy because for many, many years people identify conservatism in the terms of John Stuart Mill as the stupid party, the stupid cause, the cause of people who are too ignorant to argue, to think, insufficiently cultivated to know about alternatives. And I think what Kirk did was to show, no, this is actually the opposite of the truth, that conservatism can exist in an ignorant form, but it exists also in a highly articulate, imaginative and intelligent form, and it's in the latter form that it is best equipped to deal with socialism and liberalism as its enemies. I think I would say that his political philosophy, although it does encapsulate some of the most important ideals of conservatism, is in the end unrealistic. It doesn't actually face up to the reality of the modern world, and you can't base a political philosophy simply upon the rejection of the world around you. You must accept it in its fundamental structures and try, where necessary, to alter them, and also to preserve what is good in them. And of course, the essence of a conservative politics is to recognise that things are much more easy to destroy than to create, and that people are imperfect. And against the background of those premises, there's only a very limited scope for any radical alteration. That's really a disagreement with him on the practical implications of conservatism. As for the theoretical basis of it, I think I accept more or less the kinds of values, at least, that he put forward as underlying the conservative vision. I would put much more emphasis on law than he does, I suspect, and less on the transcendental and religious and metaphysical background. I met him only twice, once when I went to Mecosta to one of his working seminars and was given my little room on the estates, and had a wonderful time, I must admit, in very gentlemanly surroundings, discussing matters of great importance. He was present always as very much as an English aristocrat would be, visiting the guests after dinner, so to speak. I think I never really got to know him personally. He was just a figure in the background to which deference was paid, but also, who was simply the last word or a court of appeal against which all the quarrels of his disciples would be finally settled. I think that he certainly did have a Gothic mind, and it was a romantic mind, and it suffered from all the faults of the romantic mind, in that it was turned away from the world to a great extent, but also many of the virtues of the romantic mind too. He had imagination. He was able to bring to his assessment of the American social and political scene a whole range of alternatives and a vision of human destiny of a rare complexity. But I suppose it has its weaknesses, that view. I wouldn't say that his advocacy of a kind of aristocracy was a weakness, however, because I think people have always recognized that American democracy is not a matter of bringing everything down to the lowest level, but on the contrary of attempting at least to raise everything up to the highest and create a community of aristocrats. And when you say that he believed in an aristocracy of gentlemen and scholars, that may be true, but the ironical thing is that America has become an aristocracy of scholars, and they are all liberals. I think the Clinton administration is a very good illustration of the way in which this scholarly, or at least intellectual, aristocracy has taken over the nation and doesn't know what to do with it. As a result, the ordinary American voter, who is much more a genuine aristocrat than these people, has turned against them. The culture that America has is really the culture that we have. It's founded on Christian principles and the English common law and the parliamentary tradition. And along with these, of course, the language and literature that is common to us, and the common history. The interesting thing about Kirk is that although he is, of course, very English in his sympathies, like T.S. Eliot, who greatly influenced him, it's only an American who could look at England in quite that way, because he is looking to England to give an ideal of political and social order against which to measure the American reality. For an Englishman, England can't be an ideal, it's a reality. And so we are, I think, much more realistic, much less nostalgic, much less golden-aged, so to speak, in our approach to England. I would agree that there is in Kirk's vision, as I said, this element of nostalgia, which is very much dependent upon the fact that he could defend the English constitution, the English way of doing things, and English institutions from a point of view outside them. So he wasn't obliged to recognise both either their fragility or the extent to which they were themselves dynamic things. But there is an implied contrast between tradition and change, as though these were incompatible or in some way contradictory ideals. And I think that that is wrong. This is something which I believe T.S. Eliot most vividly put before modern thinkers, that the concept of tradition might itself depend upon a certain kind of systematic and regular change, while change itself is meaningless if it is engaged in for its own sake and isn't measured against some kind of enduring tradition. These are two things which require each other, and I believe that the positive side of Kirk's philosophy is based on a recognition of that. This is one of the deep questions, how you reconcile the necessary commitment to the market economy with this equally necessary commitment to traditional institutions. And I think this is something that we see in English conservatism from the beginning, that Edmund Burke was famous for having defended both those approaches, the free market in economics and tradition in social matters. And the same is true of Oakeshott, and interestingly it's true of Hayek too. And many people say that the untrammeled addiction to the market is always going to be the enemy of institutions and traditions. I believe that it isn't the enemy, but there is a tension between them, and the whole purpose of politics, or one of the major purposes of politics, is to moderate that tension and achieve some kind of compromise. I think it's certainly true that socialism in Britain has brought about a general demoralisation of society in both senses. I mean that people are themselves demoralised in that their will, sense of responsibility have been atrophied. And also there is a demoralisation in the other sense, that there is less moral thinking, much more self-centred thinking. And I think that is an inevitable consequence of the growth of the modern socialist state, which brings about a wholly new kind of person who's dependent on the state, regards his own livelihood as a right and not as his own responsibility. But of course you have to remember that socialist governments have been the exception and not the rule. It's the socialist mentality which has seeped into the lower stratum of society and created this new class of state dependence. And I think those are the people who most of all display this kind of spiritual emptiness that Kirk was referring to. I think every conservative is concerned about the decline in institutions, because after all, conservatism doesn't mean anything other than the attempt to support and maintain a body of institutions. And it is true that ours have begun to decay in fairly unpredictable ways. My own feeling is that the Church of England has, as it were, engaged in an act of corporate suicide, And it's the leadership of the Church of England, much more than the ordinary congregation, which is responsible for this. As for the monarchy, I think the problem there is really compounded, at least, by the fact that the media have got so unscrupulous, have become so unscrupulous about prying into the private lives of the royal family and revealing and talking about things which they have no right to talk about, and against which the royal family itself has no defence. I think this development, though, is something which Kirk would have foreseen, the rise of the mediocrity and the way in which the whole agenda of politics is dictated now, not by politicians, not by the institutions of social life, but simply by what happens to look good on the front page of a newspaper. The interesting thing about Mrs. Thatcher's government is that it was influenced very heavily by American conservatism, but it wasn't Kirk's kind of conservatism, with the emphasis on tradition and values and so on. It was the more individualistic conservatism associated with, perhaps ultimately with Ayn Rand and people like that. This emphasis on the free market, the individual, his responsibilities, breaking free from the state, and asserting oneself as an entrepreneurial character. And I think, although Mrs. Thatcher in herself is very much an English Tory of the old tradition, there's a limit to the extent to which you can sell that philosophy in a democratic age. I think Mrs. Thatcher actually had very little philosophy. What she did have was an enormous dynamism and this huge personality and leadership, which was what the country needed in order to break free of its socialist mindset. But she left behind her this vacuum into which some principles and some proper philosophical thinking ought to have flown, and it didn't. British conservatism as a political practice has always prided itself on not having any theory, not having any principles, but only day-to-day adjustments. And this has been a very successful strategy in the last 100 years, partly because the principles were there but never spoken about, never discussed. They were there, as it were, in an underground way. The problem is that because of this reluctance ever to attach itself to principles, in the modern age where everything is exposed to examination and dialogue, the Conservative Party does find itself at a loss as to what it stands for. And I think that this is the root of its present crisis, that it hasn't really got the vision with which to persuade people, once again, to attach themselves to it. And it does require a great deal of new thinking, or if you like, old thinking, to replace this vacuum that has grown in the middle of it.